So let's get started. Thank you for being here and not choosing the other session, which is quite a competition for mine. Yeah, let's get started. I have a lot to cover. If you have any questions, please interrupt me. Just ask the questions. And it's my problem to press on with the presentation and get through with all of it. So, my name is Nicholas Dilly. I'm a team lead at Macro Factory. That's a small consultancy in South Germany. RDS MVP, yeah, follow me on Twitter, we'll get in touch. So let's look at the agenda. Like I said in the description, I'd only like to give you a short introduction to desired state configuration. There are many, many people who have covered the basics, and they invest a lot of time to prepare material. They provide hours and hours of stuff, of videos, of demos. So I'll just assume that you're that happy about that excited about DSC, that you look at that stuff and then come back to my slides and thank me for my best practices that I brought for you. So first, I'd like to talk about DSC and the design goals, what Microsoft wanted to achieve with PowerShell Desired State Configuration, and then move on to the stuff I learned in my journey with desired state configuration. First of all, the style, how to write proper configurations that help you to define complex configurations, and move on to a security part, how to protect your configurations, your credentials, to protect yourself from any kind of attacks. Well, some attacks. I'll not be that presumptuous that I'll tell you about all attacks. Then I'll tell you about my custom resource. Ian was so nice to mention it yesterday. I have written a resource to deploy remote desktop services, which is not as cool as publishing a resource for deploying Zen app and Zen desktop, but yeah, maybe you'll have a look at it. And in the end, now what? I'll give you a lot of hints how to get started with DSC and how to stay in touch, who to follow, and all that stuff. Okay, let's take a look at DSC. Who of you has been in Ian's session yesterday? Just a quick show of hands. Okay, oh, you were there as well. Yeah, awesome. And who of you has ever played around with DSC? Okay. So, who's familiar with PowerShell? Yeah, that's what I wanted to see. So, PowerShell is an imperative language. What you want to achieve, you have to do yourself. That means, for example, if you want to install a feature, first you get information about the feature. Is that readable? Yeah. It is, isn't it? Great. So you collect some information about the feature with the get Windows feature commandlet, then check whether it's installed, and if it isn't, you install it. But the problem is, now, let's first look at the other side. Desired state configuration is declarative. You just declare the state that you want a system to achieve. So you just tell desired state configuration that you want a feature to be present. And desired state configuration makes it so. So why is that better than imperative code? On one hand, imperative code is your responsibility. So it's your responsibility to do error checking, to do reboot handling, and those are two things that can get messy. So reboot handling is messy, and error handling, you can mess it up in many, many ways, like forgetting to catch certain exceptions, and then your code breaks. Is that better when you use DSC? Well, it may be, because the code is contained in resources, and those resources are hopefully published on the internet, so everybody can take a look, everybody can get involved and improve the code, so that based on that, based on the community, you can hope that code will improve over time and give you a very stable resource to achieve what you want to do. So DSC in itself will work across reboots, and if the resource is properly written, it will catch the errors that the code might throw. Okay, some properties of desired state configuration. One thing is, like Ian presented yesterday, it's idempotent. That means no matter how often you repeat to call that code, how often you apply a configuration to a node, it will always achieve the same result. So item and potent means same power. You achieve the same. Another important thing is that it's monotonic. That means that the order in which resources or configuration items that you define, in the order in which they are applied, always stays the same if you're using dependencies. So if you define that Windows feature is required for another item to be installed, that order will be preserved. If you do not use dependencies, it may shuffle around. But if you do not use dependencies, you might not care if it's applied in any certain order. And one thing that's very important when designing a resource, be minimalistic. Don't try to write a resource to solve everything at once. Rather focus on a very specific task and do that properly. Well, it's probably not a new thing for most of you, because if you write PowerShell functions or write PowerShell code, you try to factor out individual parts of your code, put that into a function, and try to make sure that this function does a small job perfectly. It's the same thing with DSC resources. Just focus on a specific task, put that in a resource, and don't try to save the world. Okay, we're on the same page so far. Any questions? Okay, let's move on. How do I get from a blank page to a configured node? The first thing is the authoring phase. In our Windows world, we use PowerShell to write a configuration. So you take Notepad, ISE, whatever you like to use, Visual Studio Code, whatever, and write a configuration. Like I said, in declarative code, you define what you want to achieve. And when you run that code, the code is automatically turned into a MOF file. That's a standardized document that's platform independent. So you can actually create that MOF on any kind of system, be it Windows, Linux, Unix, whatever, and push it to whatever system you want. You just need to make sure that the system that receives the MOF file is able to interpret it, so that it has the correct resources, the correct code to make it so what is defined in your configuration. For example, Microsoft has already extended Desired State Configuration to Linux, so you can create configurations on a Windows system, push that to a Linux box, and configure it that way. And because it's all standards-based, it's based on standards by the Distributed Management Task Force, you could also do it the other way around. Okay, so after authoring a PowerShell document and compiling a MOF document, comes the staging phase. At that point, the configuration is presented to a client. There are two methods how to do that. The first is push. When you take the configuration document, throw it at a node, and tell it to apply that document. That's great for testing, great for demos, because it's very easy to do. The other way, that's more for larger environments, is pull mode, where you tell a node to check with a server if that has a configuration for a specific node. So that's something we'll look at in the security part of the presentation. So, yeah, Carl?
So I'm going to write everything in PowerShell, then it's going to take that, and then actually that will create the MOF file?
Yeah, that's right.
Because I've looked at those MOF files on my system, and those things are beyond.
They're really hard to read. Yeah, it's nothing you want to do.
No.
But they are clear text. You can read them. So
yeah.
Sometimes...
Well, I can read it, I can't understand it.
Yeah, but the funny thing is, after writing several configurations, you'll notice that the declarative code that you wrote in a PowerShell script can be found in the MOF file, just in another format. So there are some certain keywords that you have to filter out, but in the end you'll find the name of your configuration item and a list of parameters that you want to pass on. It's just another format, but you can read it. In the end, it's very helpful, because to make sure that your MOF file is correct, just open an editor, go through it, and you realize that it's hopefully what you have defined previously in your PowerShell script.
Okay, so what's the process to compile to MOF? Is that a command line?
You just, well, if you define a configuration, we'll look at that in a few minutes.
Okay.
Well, it works a lot like a function. You just define it with a configuration keyword and then run it like a function, and that compiles a MOV file and puts that in the file system.
Okay.
Okay, now we know how MOV document is transferred to a client. That client can start to make it so. We use that phrase a lot with DSC because Jeffrey Snover, who invented all that stuff, used an analogy where Captain Picard tells Commander Riker to do something, like, I want you to lead a mission on some kind of planet, make it so, and Commander Riker just says, yes, sir. So that's why Jeffrey Snover decided to use the term make it so, because you just tell a node to make it so with a certain kind of configuration. Okay, and every Windows node has a service called Local Configuration Manager, and that is responsible for taking the MOV document and applying it. And applying is, that is done in PowerShell again. So the MOV document is just a standardized document that's platform independent to transport the configuration between systems, but the authoring can be done, should be done in PowerShell, and applying a configuration is done in PowerShell in those resources that I mentioned earlier. Okay. Style. We'll have a look at two types of configuration, two types of style you can use to write a configuration. And those of you who have seen Ian's session, they'll notice that, well, apparently if you write a more complex configuration, there's only one way to go. So you can use parameters. I'll show some code in a few minutes. So it looks a lot like a function. You use parameters to pass on information to a configuration. Like, let's say you want to create a domain controller, you pass a domain name, you pass the credentials for the domain administrator, and that kind of stuff. So what that gives you is validation that you know from scripts. You can tell a parameter to be mandatory, you can check the validity, you can check the type. You can also use parameter sets. So it looks a lot like a PowerShell function. But what you have to do is you have to supply every parameter explicitly. You have just to tell it domain name is this and that. Node name is this and that. Another method to do that, and that is what you've seen yesterday in Ian's session, is you use something called configuration data. Configuration data is actually just a large data structure defined in a PowerShell object notation. Who's familiar with JSON? Okay, so PowerShell object notation is just something similar that's directly readable with PowerShell without any kind of commandlet to import the data structure. So the great thing about the configuration data is you have that large data structure. It defines the nodes, the parameters, and your configuration is able to pull all kinds of information from any kind of part of this data structure. It's not as strict as using parameters, where you tell it to use a certain value for a certain parameter. So let's get on with this quickly so I can show you some code. Think of configuration data like splatting. Who knows splatting in PowerShell? Just like what I've shown you here. You want to call a PowerShell commandlet, and instead of passing individual parameters, you create a hash table. Every parameter is one key in the hash table, and the parameter value is passed as the value for the key in the hash table. And you just throw that at the commandlet. Big advantage is you don't have to call the commandlet in different ways. So you just you just build a hash table with several conditions, loops, whatever you need, and then throw that hash table at the commandlet, and well, it works with the parameters you have specified in the hash table. Okay. Great thing about configuration data is also that as it is just a single data structure, it's an easy interface from any kind of third-party system. Think of a CMDB, where you have a large list of systems, of configuration items, parameters. You can just build a large data structure and use that to create configurations. So no need to use explicit calls to use code when connecting your CMDB to a tool like DSC. Okay. Complexity. The thing is, if you try to use parameters, you're very much limited to writing very simple single-purpose configurations, because you have to supply everything explicitly in parameters. That forces you either to write a long list of parameters or to start supplying data structures to parameters. So that means that gets very complicated, very messy. So if you want to use node configurations that look a lot more like service descriptions, and that's what Ian did yesterday, he had a large configuration and individual parts for storefront, for XANAP delivery controller, for the session host. And the configuration data is, let's say, a description of your environment that you want to create using your configurations. So let's skip ahead for a bit. Like I said, only configuration data allows you to build complex node configurations. And mind, if I say complex, I do not mean complicated. So don't confuse those two words. Complex just like it is long or it has many levels. But if you think about it, look at it, think about it, you'll be able to understand it. Okay. No, just a bit too fast. So look at some code. This is a node configuration that uses parameters. It has a special keyword at the top that says configuration. You can just read function, because in fact just tells PowerShell it is some kind of function and it needs to output a morph. But in the end, what you do is a lot like a function. You have a parameter block and you define parameters just as you do everywhere else. And at some point further down, you have a section called node, and at that point you define which node needs to apply that configuration. And in this case, you have supplied a node name as a parameter and told it you want to send a special kind of configuration to that node. So that is the direct connection between the parameters you set, the configuration you wrote, and the node you wanted to apply to. So if we move further down, and then inside the node section, I've just folded those two regions. I have one region to tell it to install some roles and features, in this case to create a domain controller, and then two configuration items to create the actual domain controller. So let's see if I can, just to give you an impression what this looks like. For example, like the example on one of the first slides, you have a section called Windows feature, and it tells DSC that this certain feature needs to be present. And further down, we have a region for the domain controller. There are two items that are necessary. XAD domain tells the node to create a new domain. And second item waits for the domain to be created, so that node returns information. This domain controller is up and running. You can now start to connect to it and use, install a service that depends on a domain controller. Okay, so why is this, what does it look like if we use configuration data? So configuration data, I'd use some kind of structure like this here. Part of it is predefined that you need to use. Another part you can set freely. Like you have the configuration data is a hash. The all nodes item is an array. And inside this all nodes array, you have hash tables that define a single node. So in this case, I have a node that is identified by a GUID, and I tell it to that it needs a certain role, and this role is first domain controller. And the configuration that's down here uses the data from the configuration data to pull in the information that it needs, like the domain name and the credentials and that stuff. So what you can easily see here, if I have several nodes and define roles for all the nodes that I have in this list, that gives me a description of the environment that I want to create. And that can be a lot more complex, like several storefront servers, several delivery controllers, and so on and so on. So what we've seen now is, if you use parameters, you have to supply information explicitly. If you use configuration data, you can define whole environments. That's the first thing I'd like you to take away here. So let's move on. I talked about pull servers at the beginning. Actually, there are two types of pull servers. The first is an SMB share, and the second is an IIS-based, a web-based pull server. In the end, I'll only be talking about the IIS-based pull server because you have a lot more flexibility, and you're not dependent on sorting out the permissions of some kind of node to access the share. Because if you're doing domain joins with DSC, it gets really messy to determine which node or how a node gets access to the file share that is domain-based. So one thing is you want to protect yourself against man-in-the-middle attacks. So if you retrieve a configuration from the pull server, you definitely want to use HTTPS so that there's no one that can intercept your call and send you some kind of information that, some kind of node configuration, that attacks your environment. So first thing, important thing, if you're using a pull server, IIS-based, use HTTPS with a trusted CA. Second thing, you want to protect yourself against eavesdropping, someone who tries just to pull your configuration from a wire. Again, HTTPS is your friend. Server authentication helps against this. But there are other things like foreign devices that, let's say, somehow got hold of your root certificate and are able to connect to your server or are able to just, they actually don't need the root certificate, just connect to the HTTPS server, ignore the security message, and they can pull node configurations from your pull server. So what you want to do in the end is use client authentication as well. And that gets really tricky because you certainly need a CA to create client certificates for all the nodes, but it does help a lot because you can make sure that only those nodes that you want to connect to the pull server are able to do that. And it protects you against something, let's say it's a GUID harvesting. So you can just try out lots and lots of GUIDs and check which kind of node configurations I can retrieve from the pull server. And those node configurations tell me a lot about the environment. Because those node configurations tell me what kind of services are installed on which node and how they're configured. That's some crucial information I don't want to share with anybody. So to protect your node configurations, two things: confidentiality, use a pull server with client authentication. Second thing is credential encryption. Like if you're creating a domain controller, you certainly want to supply a recovery password and credentials for the domain administrator. And those credentials just need to be encrypted because they may be intercepted on the wire, and you don't want those credentials in the hands of someone who's not your employee, not an administrator of your environment. So that's why you have two things to make sure. First is to use client authentication to limit who's accessing your pull server. Second is encrypt the credentials contained in node configuration. Another thing is GUID management. A pull server does not rely on a node name, but on a global unique identifier. So you have to come up with some kind of way how to manage those GUIDs. That is something that Microsoft has not solved for you. You have to come up with a solution. You can use a GUID from Active Directory, but then you have to use domain joined computers. If you want to start DSC at an earlier stage, like at a blank installation, you'll probably use random GUIDs and store them in some kind of database, text files, whatever. So that's a field where Microsoft does not provide a solution and well, leaves a lot of room for third-party vendors. Ian?
I don't know if you've seen in the latest WMF5 preview, they've got rid of the configuration GUIDs in a pull server mode, and they've changed the configuration name.
Yeah.
You still have an Asian GUID, but the configuration is no longer
Yeah,
GUID.
I guess they reacted that GUID management is a mess at the moment.
Yes.
Okay, you also have to decide whether you use a GUID per computer, per node, or use a GUID per service. So for DSC, it doesn't matter if a GUID is used several times because the pull server doesn't care who pulls the configuration. You just have to make sure that a node pulls the correct configuration and well, results in the correct kind of service. Okay. I talked about two types of certificates, one to do the client authentication, one to do the credential encryption. And to give an impression, that is also a kind of desired state configuration, node configuration, and it tells the local configuration manager that this node needs some kind of configuration. You tell it to use a pull server. Up here in the server URL, you tell it that connections must not be unsecure, and you give it two certificates. One certificate is the certificate ID, the thumbprint, for the download manager, and that's the one it uses for client authentication. And the configuration ID further down, that one is used for credentials encryption. So, and if that's working correctly, you'll see something like this in the event log of a node, and it says that the web download manager, that's the thing that goes out to the IIS and fetches a node configuration, is using this thumbprint of a certificate for this configuration ID. So that's a very easy way to check what's actually happening. If you fetch the correct thumbprint, use it for the correct node configuration. So great for debugging. Okay, any questions so far? Awesome. Next thing, class-based resources. When you decide or notice that the kind of configuration they want to achieve is not covered by an existing resource, you can either move on to another tool and not use DSC, but I'd rather see you create a custom resource. And class-based resources are new in WMF5. They are based on PowerShell classes, and they actually force you to use an object-oriented design paradigm. That is a lot, that may be great for those of you who have written managed code, done some developing, but for scripters it's also great because when you're authoring a resource, it makes it a lot easier because a traditional resource, not class-based, uses exactly 3 functions, and those 3 functions need exactly the same parameters. So a traditional resource has the same parameter definition in 3 places. If you use a class-based resource, you define properties of a class once at the top of a class, and the methods get, set, and test that are required for a resource do not require any further parameters. They just use the properties of the class. So in the end, a lot easier. It also has a proper integration with PowerShell modules. A traditional resource is, you leave that in a folder called DSC resource inside a PowerShell module. On the other hand, a class-based resource is just put in the PSM1 file in the PowerShell module. There's one known issue. If you're using a pull server, you can also deploy the resources that are required to apply configuration using the pull server. But unfortunately, that does not work at the moment with a class-based resource. But I expect that to be fixed in the RTM of WMF5, because that's just a vital element that you not only deploy a node configuration, but also the required resources to apply this configuration. Okay, what have I done? Who of you is familiar with remote desktop services? Great. So I'll just run through the slide. How does it work? Yeah, it's so similar to Citrix, XenApp, web component, broker, session host, some management tool. Okay, so what have I done? I've written a resource called cRemote Desktop Services. The C is a naming convention, meaning that it's a community-based resource. And it does several things. First of all, it can create a remote desktop session deployment, a quick and a standard deployment. That means either on a single host or on multiple hosts. That's the first step. Second thing I did so far is adding a new session host to an existing deployment and adding a new web access host to an existing deployment. Okay. This is available at GitHub. You can download it, take a look at it, get involved, fix my code. There are probably some bugs in it. So I invite you to test it out. What happens in the end is, I've recorded a short video for you. First of all, I'll show you that it's PowerShell 5. So WMF5 is installed. I use this class-based resource. I have a configuration that actually does simple deployment. First of all, the proof that there's no deployment existing on this host. So Server Manager tells us no deployment, so I can apply my configuration and tell this server to do a quick deployment. That means web access, connection broker, and session host get installed on exactly this node. I'm using push. Don't know if you can read this. I use the start DSC configuration commandlet, tell it where to find the MOF file I wanted to apply, and tell it to wait. That means I see all the console output. So now the local configuration manager takes the MOF file and makes it so. I'll jump ahead because we see a lot of yellow output. And at some point, it finishes, and the server manager shows me in just a few seconds down here, we have a deployment with my server RDS-01, which has all three roles. So, not very surprising, it does create an entire deployment. You can also do that, like I said, as a standard deployment and deploy those roles on different servers. Okay, second demo, I decided to add a new session host to the deployment, and I do that remotely. I'm still logged on to the first server that I just used to create a quick deployment. Oh, they're already finished. Okay, and tell a second server to apply another configuration and add itself to the existing deployment. So again, let's jump ahead. And in the end, I do a refresh and we see a second server appears with a session host role. Okay? So like I said, those three things are the things that you can do with the resource at the moment. What I'm planning to do is actually, I want to be able to create collections. I want to be able to create and configure remote apps. And at some point in the future, I'm thinking about high availability for the connection broker. I'm also thinking about managing the certificates of an RDS deployment, because the commanders are there. So it's just a matter of wrapping code around it and turning it into a resource. And some configuration for the session host. Okay, some caveats for custom resources. Something that Ian touched on yesterday is execution context. So the LCM makes everything so as system. And if you're doing a quick deployment, deploying all the RDS roles on the same server, it does work. But if you're trying to do a standard deployment and going out to other servers and installing the roles on other servers and building the deployment, that doesn't work with a system account. There are two options. I'm currently using the first one in my module. I use invoke command, to the same server, the server that the node configuration is currently applied on, and supplying credentials. The second option is new in the WMF5 preview from April, and you can give any configuration item, every resource that you define in your configuration, a parameter called PSDSC run as credential. And what the LCM does, it uses those credentials to change the execution context. Great and easy, because it works for, I think it works for all resources except for one. I think it's a process resource, but doesn't matter. I'm almost certain that I'll not use that, because I want to force the users of my resource to use special credentials. If I don't do that, the first attempts to create a deployment will certainly fail. So I'd rather have a special parameter to force you to use credentials that will make it work with the first try. Okay, second thing, double hop authentication. That's also a very nasty thing, not only in DSC, but also in administering with remote PowerShell. Because if I use invoke command, like I showed on the previous slide, it will only give you the option, the possibility of running commands in another context on the same node. If you're trying to go to another node, this will fail because the credentials cannot be delegated by default. So you need to configure cred SSP. That is a bit of a mess. You need to tell every host that it accepts cred SSP and which host can delegate credentials to which other host. Great thing is, PSDSC run as credential solves that for you. So that's a big advantage of this new parameter, because you don't have to care about double hop authentication. So maybe I'll think about which way I go in my resource. Okay, now what? I've shown you some stuff that I learned before and while writing the custom resource. First thing you should do if you want to get involved with PowerShell Desired State Configuration is learn. There are two awesome courses at Microsoft Virtual Academy. They are by Jeffrey Snober, who invented PowerShell DSC, PowerShell and DSC that is, and Jason Helmick. It's a blast to watch. It's many, many hours, but it covers the basics, has great examples, and it's just fun. Those two guys are just a blast, so make sure you watch those. Get involved. If you find any bugs in resources that are provided by Microsoft, just go out to GitHub, fork, make a pull request with the changes, and Microsoft will that incorporate in new versions of the resources. And of course, Twitter. There's a lot happening on Twitter. I just did a Follow Friday on Sunday, so there are some people that may be of help for you. And of course, the web. So in the end, what have we seen? I've shown you some of the design goals, what DSC does, and how it works from a very high perspective. Oops. I've shown you some style guidelines. Use configuration data, for example. Try to do service descriptions. Describe your environment and configuration data, and try to create many node configurations at once from a single configuration. Security, there are some things you need to look out when building a pull server. Some stuff you have to take care of when you're writing your own resources. And of course, what you can do in the future, get involved, learn. If you have any questions, just get in touch with me. I'll be happy to help out. And any questions left? Ian?
How and where do you see this being used in production? How DSC as a whole? It's a bit of an open-ended question. I'd just like to see.
Yeah. Well, German customers are very reluctant to use new technologies. That's the first thing that prevents me from using it with customers. But I'm currently working with a service provider and well, pushing them in, to automate more, and they have some interest for DSC. So maybe I'll be able to move that customer into the direction of DSC. We're using it at a company, at Mako Factory, for some hosts. But in the end, it's a long discussion with customers. They're very reluctant, especially if you tell them to use WMF5 preview to run DSC. That's a very hard one. So I don't see any traction with customers right now.
It's a fantastic tool.
Yeah, it is.
But I just struggle at the moment to see how it's going to fit into your typical traditional enterprise IT.
Yeah, but the thing is, if you're moving to a public cloud, you can just work with images, and it's very easy to throw configuration at any kind of images. And I think we have to change our thinking in on-premises data centers, so that we have the same mindset, work with clones, with images, and then use the same technologies like DSC or Chef, Puppet, whatever, to create a configuration, to create an environment. But it's also a very long way to go. Okay?
It wasn't built in a day.
Yeah. So thanks a lot, and I'll see you around.